Welcome to History with Herodotus, where we delve into the depths of human experience, uncovering the complexities and wonders of our collective past. Today, we embark on a journey through one of the most pivotal and far-reaching events of the 20th century, the Great Depression. This calamitous period, which ravaged the global economy and left an indelible mark on the world, is a testament to the intricate web of causes and consequences that shape human history. The Roaring Twenties, with their vibrant culture, technological innovations, and soaring stock markets, seemed to herald an era of unprecedented prosperity. Yet, beneath the surface of this glittering facade, subtle cracks were beginning to form. The global economy, still reeling from the devastation of World War I, was struggling to find its footing. The war had left many nations with crippling debt, while the introduction of new technologies and manufacturing processes was disrupting traditional industries and displacing workers. In the United States, the boom of the 1920s was fueled in part by a speculative frenzy on Wall Street, where investors were eager to capitalize on the promise of new technologies and emerging markets. The stock market, once a staid and reliable institution, had become a hotbed of speculation, with prices skyrocketing to dizzying heights. As the market continued its ascent, many Americans, from humble investors to wealthy tycoons, became caught up in the frenzy, buying stocks on margin and hoping to strike it rich. Meanwhile, the global economy was becoming increasingly interconnected, with trade agreements and international finance playing a larger role than ever before. The gold standard, which had long been the foundation of international currency exchange, was beginning to show signs of strain. As countries struggled to maintain their gold reserves, they were forced to implement austerity measures, including higher interest rates and reduced government spending, which only served to exacerbate the growing economic instability. In Europe, the aftermath of World War I continued to cast a long shadow. The Treaty of Versailles, with its harsh reparations and territorial adjustments, had created an environment of resentment and economic hardship. Germany, in particular, was struggling to come to terms with the war's devastating legacy, including hyperinflation, widespread unemployment, and a crippling burden of debt. As the 1920s drew to a close, these disparate threads began to weave together into a complex tapestry of economic instability. The global economy, once thought to be impervious to collapse, was beginning to exhibit signs of strain. Commodity prices were falling, international trade was slowing, and the speculative bubble on Wall Street was starting to show signs of deflation. It was against this backdrop of growing uncertainty that the first major tremors of the Great Depression began to make themselves felt. In the summer of 1929, a series of ominous events began to unfold. Wheat prices, which had been falling steadily throughout the year, plummeted to historic lows, devastating farmers and agricultural communities across the American heartland. As the harvest season approached, it became clear that the anticipated bumper crop would only serve to further depress prices, leading countless families on the brink of financial ruin. As the wheat prices continued to plummet, the effects began to ripple throughout the economy, exposing the deep-seated vulnerabilities of the global financial system. On October 24, 1929, also known as Black Thursday, panic selling swept through the stock market, with investors frantically trying to unload their shares as prices plummeted. The chaos was palpable, with stock tickers unable to keep up with the frenzied pace of trading, and brokerage firms facing crushing waves of sell orders. In the days that followed, the situation only grew more dire. On October 29, 1929, now infamous as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed in spectacular fashion, with stocks losing nearly half their value in a single day. The once mighty skyscrapers of Wall Street, which had seemed to touch the heavens just months before, now stood as monuments to hubris and folly. As the dust settled, it became clear that the very foundations of the global economy had been shaken, leaving millions of Americans facing an uncertain future. As the winter of 1929-1930 set in, the effects of the economic downturn began to manifest in stark relief. Banks, which had invested heavily in the stock market, found themselves facing a devastating wave of withdrawals as depositors rushed to claim their savings. The resulting bank runs, which saw long lines of desperate citizens waiting to withdraw their funds, only served to accelerate the collapse of the financial system. By the spring of 1930, over 1,300 banks had failed, taking with them the life savings of countless families. The human cost of this economic devastation was staggering. As factories shut down and businesses went bankrupt, unemployment soared, leaving millions of Americans without a steady income. The once thriving cities of the industrial North, which had been the engines of America's prosperity, were now reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. In Detroit, for example, where the automobile industry had once reigned supreme, over 50% of the workforce was left idle, with many families forced to rely on charity or government assistance just to survive. In the face of such unrelenting hardship, President Herbert Hoover struggled to respond effectively, his administration hamstrung by a deep-seated commitment to laissez-faire economics. As the crisis deepened, Hoover's reputation as a leader began to suffer, with many Americans coming to view him as out of touch with the struggles of ordinary people. "No one is actually starving," he declared in a statement that would come to haunt him. "The hobos are better fed than they have ever been before." Such comments only served to further erode public confidence as the nation teetered on the brink of economic collapse. As 1930 drew to a close, the situation continued to deteriorate, with the global economy now firmly entrenched in a downward spiral. The international trade system, which had once been a powerful engine of growth, was now in shambles as countries turned to protectionist policies in a desperate bid to shield their domestic industries. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, passed by Congress in June 1930, was a prime example of this trend, imposing steep tariffs on imported goods and sparking retaliatory measures from other nations. The consequences of such actions were far-reaching, as the global economy began to break down into competing blocs, each seeking to protect its own interests at the expense of others. The resulting collapse in international trade only served to accelerate the decline, with world trade volumes plummeting by over 60% between 1929 and 1934. As the world slid deeper into depression, it became clear that the crisis was far from over, and that the worst was yet to come. The summer of 1931 brought a new wave of disasters, as a series of devastating droughts and heat waves swept across the American heartland, destroying crops and livestock on a massive scale. The Dust Bowl, as it came to be known, would eventually affect over 100 million acres of land, displacing hundreds of thousands of farmers and rural communities. As the ecological disaster unfolded, it became clear that the economic crisis was not just a financial phenomenon, but a deeply human one, with far-reaching consequences for the very fabric of American society. As the autumn of 1931 approached, the situation continued to deteriorate, with banks failing at an alarming rate and unemployment soaring to unprecedented heights. In October 1931, over 20% of the American workforce was left idle, with many more facing reduced hours or wages. The resulting poverty and desperation were starkly evident as shantytowns sprang up in cities across the nation, housing thousands of families who had lost their homes and livelihoods. As the autumn of 1931 gave way to the winter of 1932, the situation continued to deteriorate, with banks failing at an alarming rate and unemployment soaring to unprecedented heights. In February 1932, Congress established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a federal agency designed to provide emergency loans to struggling banks and industries. However, this measure ultimately proved insufficient to stem the tide of economic collapse. By the spring of 1932, over 25% of the American workforce was left idle, with many more facing reduced hours or wages. The presidential election of 1932 marked a significant turning point in the crisis, as Franklin D. Roosevelt's campaign promises of bold action and sweeping reform resonated deeply with a desperate electorate. Upon taking office in March 1933, Roosevelt swiftly implemented a series of radical measures designed to stimulate economic recovery, including the establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, and the Works Progress Administration. Roosevelt's New Deal policies, though imperfect and often experimental, helped to stabilize the financial system, create jobs, and provide a sense of hope and renewal to a beleaguered nation. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which separated commercial and investment banking, and the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which established the Securities and Exchange Commission, were particularly significant in restoring confidence in the financial sector. As the economy slowly began to recover, the worst excesses of the Great Depression gradually receded, though the scars of the crisis would take decades to fully heal. The Great Depression ultimately concluded with the onset of World War II, as massive government spending and mobilization efforts helped to pull the United States out of its economic slump. The war itself would prove a crucible for American society, forging a new sense of national purpose and unity in the face of existential threat. As historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. later observed, the Great Depression and World War II formed a kind of double crisis which shattered the old order and opened the way to a new era of American history. Today, the Great Depression is remembered as one of the most significant and transformative events in modern American history, a searing testament to the fragility of economic systems and the resilience of the human spirit. Its legacy can be seen in the enduring institutions and policies established during the New Deal era, from Social Security and unemployment insurance to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's all for today's History with Herodotus. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, remember that to understand the present, we must first understand the past.